Hello, Steve Surfoss here, continuing with this series of videos entitled Free Will. Today I'd like to take a look in John chapter 1. We're going to look at a little bit different thing, actually not a whole lot different here, but a little different thing here. In John chapter 1, let me just go ahead and read the verses and then we'll comment, and then some of you might say, well, how does that relate to free will? And I'm going to be reading the first 13 verses of John chapter 1 in the New International Version. It says thus, Gospel of John chapter 1 verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or of a husband's will, but born of God. Very beautiful chapter here, and of course we're not looking at the whole chapter, but these first 13 verses. And of course it's talking about the Word. In verse 1 we see it's the Word. We see in verse 2 that the Word was with God in the beginning. We see in verse 3 that all things were made by him, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. Verse 4 begins to get to the subject that I want us to look at in free will. Now, up to this point, if you've been following this series, and even if you haven't been following this series, we know that, we come to the first chapter of John, and he's talking about Christ coming into the world, Jesus coming into the world, and the Word coming into the world, to use his terminology in this chapter. And at this point, sin entered through Adam, and death entered through Adam and sin, and death passed to all men, as Romans says, because all men have sinned. So we have man here, sin. We talk about a sinful nature, and that's appropriate. Man is subject to a sinful nature, but he's not abandoned. The point that I'd like for us to see here in verse 4 is that man is not abandoned alone. God has not just kind of brushed him off the page and let him sit over there with the sinful nature. Let the devil do with him whatever he wants to do. In verse 4, it says, in him, it's talking about this Word, which of course is God the Son, come as the Word. In him was life. And it says in verse 4, and that life was the light of men. Now, obviously, men right here, we could say, well, certain men or some men or whatever. But just, I'd like you to look at this a moment. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. And if you follow through the word light, I think it's fair to go over also in 1 John, his epistle, and see how he talks about God being life and what implications and what that means. God is light. But it says, in him was life, and it's talking about the Son, and that life was the light of men. What does light do? And he says, the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. Okay. So here he's talking about that this light is there, it's the light of men. We're going to expand that and be more precise a little bit ahead. But he says, the light shines in darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. So the light is something to be understood. Okay, the darkness has not understood it. Verse 6, he begins to talk about John the Baptist, and he says, there came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light. What light? The light that's the Word, the light that's the Son of God coming into the world, the light that is the light of men. as it says in verse 4, to not go beyond what is said exactly in verse 4. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light. Man have not understood that light, but now that light is coming into the world, as we're going to see. And John is sent to witness, to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. And this is that through him. Now you could say, is the him referring to John the Baptist? I would say the him is referring to the light, to the Word, to Jesus, to the Son of God coming to the world. But concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. So John is giving a witness concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. And then it clarifies in verse 8, and this is a great emphasis placed in chapter 1 of John, not to confuse John the Baptist as being the light, or being the Word, or being the light of all men, but he himself was not the light. Talking about John the Baptist. He came only as a witness to the light. Now I would like for us to pay attention to verse 9. And it says, the true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. So here we see in verse 9 of chapter 1 of John that the Son of God is the light of men. And in verse 9 it says he gives light to every man coming into the world. Now, some people who do not like the concept of free will have, and I think they have a lot of logic tied on, and they don't let just Scripture speak for itself. I'm being very honest, and I realize that's a harsh comment to make. But Scripture speaking for itself here very clearly says that the true light gives light to every man that's a sinner, every man that's subject to the sinful nature, every man that's far away from God. It gives light to every man. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. Based on this verse, there's not one single man who does not have light from the true light. There's not a single man on the face of the earth, according to this Scripture, that does not have some light from God shining down upon him and on his life. He gives light to every man. And now that light is coming into the world. So we begin to see here that man's not thrown to the dogs of only the sinful nature. At the same time, there's a work of God, a light from God, to be very precise here, a light that gives light to every man. God is shining light on every man, gives light to every man. Now, some people would say, well, if God's going to do anything, if God wanted to do anything, it would have to be done, and it's absolute. And they throw a whole bunch of logic in here, which I must say right now is not in Scripture. Scripture does not say that. Here we see light coming to every man. And this light that gives light to every man is coming into the world. And I'm probably going to have to go to another video on this, but let me see how much I can get in this one. He says, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Okay? And I think, he was in the world did not recognize him. Now we're going to see, expand upon this as we go on. In verse 11 it says, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Okay, so now here we begin to see also some of the things that I pointed out previously when I talk about free will. God does one thing, man rebels and goes against that. Now some people say, oh, well, that's not really free will. Well, he came to that which was his own. Jesus came to Israel. He came to the Jewish people. Those are his people. They're his people because he's God, not only because he was a Jew, but because he called Abraham and he said, out of you I'm going to make a great nation and I'm going to bless all nations. So he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. So what do we have here? We have his own. When it says his own did not receive him, we see some of his own have light from him. They have some true light that's given to every man, and yet based with that true light, they do not receive him. It does not say here God had not ordained that they would not receive him. Now, he knew that they were not going to receive him, but here he says they were the ones that did that. The Scripture says they did not receive him. So I think they're guilty about that. Now, there's some very important things. We'll talk about this a little more in verse 12 and verse 13 in the next video on John 1 and free will. Thanks for watching.